Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason. Due to various things going on, this is going to be a two-part episode, largely covering the Season 3 William Hartnell serial, The Ark, not because this is the greatest and most complex Doctor Who story ever made and it demands 2 full weeks to discuss, but more for timing issues. Thanks to fortunate circumstances, I was able to get 2 great guest interviews for this week. Both Lelon Stoldt from the Indoctrination podcast, you've heard him on the show many times before, and Jim Sangster, my co-producer. We talked a lot about the Ark, the novelization, the usual run of other topics that we cover here on Doctor Who Literature, and a lot of talk about the current season of Doctor Who, including the episode that just released yesterday, if you are one of my Sunday release day listeners, and in the UK with Doctor Who releasing on Saturday, 73 Yards. This week I will have my conversation with Lelon immediately following the break, and then after that my largely non-spoilery review of 73 Yards, with a brief contribution from Callie. Next week my conversation with Jim Sangster, along with my audio essay on the Ark. Some of those topics we also covered in the conversation with Lelon, so it is good to have 1 week to separate those out. I have some listener mail, and then I also have one correction to make. Let's get to the correction first. During last week's conversation with Stephen B. from New to Who, talking about the West Village music scene in the 1930s and 40s, I incorrectly attributed the song Strange Fruit to Ella Fitzgerald. As longtime friend of the show, Michael Storm points out, that was Billie Holiday. And yes, I've been to the site and I have photos of the historic marker. I knew it was Billie Holiday, but Ella Fitzgerald really wanted to make her presence felt in last week's episode, so I incorrectly mistook them for one another. We also have a YouTube review, and this is from back in episode 98, The Invasion, which I covered with Pete Lambert. That was several months ago now. That was the first episode that I put on YouTube, and I now have the following YouTube review from listener John White. This is far too meandering. It's barely on topic. I did my best with it, but you need more focus on what you are trying to achieve. If you want to do a general chit-chat, do a general chit-chat stream. Don't call it a stream about the book when less than half the extensive runtime is. Could have been done in 1 hour. Story of my life, Mr. White. Story of my life. This is the 4th calendar year of this podcast, and I think you can count on the fingers of one finger, or possibly 2, episodes that I got in under an hour. That is not unusual for Doctor Who podcasts, and this is a show with a couple of different features. We have the guest interview, as well as my audio essay. Audio essays tend to range between 10 to 30 minutes, depending on how I feel about the book, and most guest interviews tend to go about an hour. This is, to be fair, one of the few complaints that I have had about length, but it is an important point to keep in mind. I will try to add to that this week by turning the Ark into a 2-part story. Part of that is because I will be out of town next weekend, and it will be easier to have a pre-recorded episode ready to go. So with the second interview and the audio essay about the novelization, that will be next week's episode when I am not home to micromanage the thing on a Saturday night. I will, of course, try to keep episodes as brief as possible going forward. I think getting under an hour is a little bit of an impossibility given the particular format that this show has. It might help to think of this week's episode as more of a talk show than a books-specific conversation. Obviously, the books are the raison d'etre of this podcast, but the show has also evolved in ways that surprise me, and the talk show format is certainly part of it. So, as I'm trying to keep these episodes down to a reasonable running time, and I've already spent several minutes of your time talking about meta details, let's get to it.
Hello, fellow time travelers, and welcome to the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, the only podcast to discuss, in story order, all the Doctor Who novelizations. My name is Tony Whit, And every 2 weeks or so, I'm joined by a 2 to 3 person discussion panel, including our so-called expert who's been a Who fan since 1979. That would be me. We also get the views of intermediate, casual, and novice fans who either have never seen the show or who have never read these books until these podcasts, including
Dalton Hughes
and
Allison Fitz-Seyfried.
You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you find good podcasts, or even ones like ours. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Enjoy your travels.
All right, Lelon, welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. I saw you at Galley a few months ago, but it's been longer than that since we last recorded.
Yes, it was before the 60th. Well, before the 60th, right?
Pretty sure. I know that when I signed you up to do the ARC episode, I didn't know exactly when on the calendar it was going to be, but it turns out that for indoctrination, you and your daughters must be right on top of the ARC, because I know I just listened to your last Dalek's Master Plan episode.
Yes, we're doing it next month. So this month is the Massacre. So I just read the Massacre, and then I just read this.
The Massacre is coming up on this show fairly soon. It's a book with a definite run-on sentence problem.
Yeah, the best thing that book did was have a page in the front that told you which characters were Huguenots and which ones were Catholics. Because I was just the first third of that book, I'm just constantly going back to the first page, and it's like, okay, he's one of these guys. Where I'm kind of like stalling because I want to do Toymaker after the release of the animation.
That's a good point.
So we're doing some. We just watched all of series 2. And we'll probably do some other kind of special thing later this summer just to push that out.
So your kids are not up to date on the new series? Are they watching on Disney Plus? I know my daughter and I just watched 73 Yards this morning.
I think the oldest watched the Christmas special. I don't remember what she thinked. They're not crazy about watching the new ones, but they are gobbling up New Who in order. So they've already moved on to season 3. They're not going to wait for the podcast anymore, especially the older one. So we're through. We're early into season 3.
So you are not quite up to John Sims' first on-screen appearance yet, but you are up to the series of episodes where the Doctor ritually abuses Martha Jones at every possible opportunity.
Yes. And then, my kids are also, I think, suffering from the same thing a lot of fandom did, which is just like the "she's not Rose" kind of thing. Like it didn't matter who it was going to be. It wasn't Rose. But yes, we've heard the name Saxon several times now, but we have not seen him yet. Those things, by the way, those things fly right past the kids. I have to point out, it's like, oh, they just said it again. You're missing it.
See, my daughter and I are in the middle of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and we just this morning reached Christine Sutherland's final appearance before the massive change to her character arc. I said, trying to avoid spoilers for those who have not watched all of Buffy yet.
Sorry, who did she play?
Joyce, the mom.
Oh, right. So season 4 or 5?
We just reached season 5, episode 15. But my kid picks up on things a lot faster than I did watching in real time back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Anytime a new character is introduced, she quickly deduces that they're going to be important or what their role is going to be. She guesses spoilers with such alarming frequency that I wonder if she isn't secretly reading the online transcripts or reading the Wikipedias before I show her the episodes, but she does clue onto these things unusually fast.
I did that to mess with my wife when we watched Game of Thrones. I hadn't read the books, but then I read the wiki and I was like guessing. I was, quote unquote, guessing all these things that were going to happen. She wasn't amused. My kids are the opposite. They think every episode the Autons are going to come out. They think every episode they look at some guy and they're like, he's an auton. I'm like, it's not that they, it's seven episodes in the row. It hasn't been the autons. I don't know why they think something about them being first. They just assume they're going to come back.
Once you reach the Stephen Moffat era, then that'll take on a lot more significance, I guess.
Oh, that's right. They do come back. So we have that. We do have that to look forward to. But they also didn't like Catherine Tate as the bride, but I'm not giving up hope yet.
She, of course, comes back in a few episodes' time from where you're sitting. I think Catherine Tate was incredible when she was doing serious roles, but I'm not sure how the broad comedy is going to go over for your kids. I am more allergic to broad comedy, whereas younger kids, I imagine, are more inured to it.
Yeah, I think they'll eat it up, actually. They think that's just hilarious.
I was going to say, when you mentioned your kids didn't take very well to Martha replacing Rose, obviously we are at a point in the classic series now in the arc where there was just a veritable revolving door of companions. The season 3 production block, which goes from Mythmakers to the Smugglers. If you count Sarah Kingdom as a companion, and I do,
I count Brett Vion as a companion.
I heard that in your Dalek Master Plan episode. Yes.
Yeah, like he's as much. I mean, if she's a companion, he's almost as much a companion. That's reading into the actor a little too, right? If it were a different actor, I don't know, but it certainly felt like he was a companion. But yeah, it's series Doctor Who season 3 is like the quickening, and each subsequent introduction has gotten a little lazier. Like, did I miss something? Like Dodo shows up at the very, very end of the massacre, right? In the book, almost not at all. And she is a presumed descendant of Anne Chaplet from the massacre. We know nothing else about her. I don't know that we were told that she's from modern day London.
There's the meta reference to her looking like Susan, which is delivered on screen because she had been on the short list to play the role that eventually went to Carol Ann Ford in 1963. And when they get back to the War Machines, which is on screen set in 1966, she knows that the post office tower was under construction, but it hadn't been finished when she left. So assume she's 63 or 64. I don't know how long it'll take to go up.
Got it. And then, she's real bad in this story, right? I don't know where the fandom is on Dodo, but it's a big step down from Vicky.
My larger point is that I don't think fandom, to the extent that you had organized fandom in 65, 66, would have been as hard on the new companions as people are today, where the presence of social media amplifies every opinion. And you can write whole news articles about what 3 people on Twitter think about a certain trend. I don't know how fandom was taking in real time to this coming and going, from Vicky to Katarina to Sarah to Dodo to Polly, and then even Polly only lasted about a year before she is quickly replaced by Victoria and Zoe. I don't know how fandom was taken to this, but I think the outrage over Martha replacing Rose and the on-screen, the way RTD pummels the character of Martha for the better part of a season because she's not Rose. I'm thankful the new series, I'm thankful the classic series didn't have time to do that. We quickly get on with Vicky. Maureen O'Brien is great. And we don't have 3 or 4 weeks worth of, Vicky has her merits, but she's no Susan. Can't we just have Susan back? The classic series wasn't doing that. They just got on with the adventuring and there was less meta hand-wringing.
Yeah, the thing with Martha is like we had 2 years of not just Rose, but like a lot of Rose's family, like a lot of it. And it worked. Like it was great. But when he tries to do the same thing again, it's immediately boring. You could not care less about Martha's family. I watched the episode earlier this week. I couldn't tell you how many there were. Like it's just it's a thing that worked one. Like Doctor Who can do anything, but it can't do like the same thing forever. And so I think part of the Martha problem was every time we went back to her family, like if it had just been her, I and obviously like no one the problem was the will they or won't they thing. If you had just established like up front, like don't have him kiss her in the first episode.
Right.
Don't even skirt the idea. Um, but I don't know if you could do that with like the two leads being as attractive and having as much chemistry as they had. Like I think people would have been asking the question, will they or won't they, regardless of what they had put on screen. Right. It's not till you have I don't think it's till you have Catherine Tate where you can actually just sell it like, yeah, they're just friends. Like there's nothing else here.
Although even then, we have to have the on-screen explanation of why they're not going to be dating. With I think Donna saying, "Oh, I'm not your mate," in her very broad accent.
Yeah. It, I think they were all great. Like I think Martha was great. I'm looking forward to finishing this season, and I think Catherine Tate was great. It is weird how Catherine Tate became like the heart of the new series in like a weird way.
Right.
And it's so good because I had forgotten at the end of The Impossible Bride where she asks him to come into dinner, and then he says yes, and he gets in the TARDIS and leaves. And so Russell T Davies like completely inverts that, right, with the special. I hadn't realized it was such a 180.
I had completely forgotten about the character of Sean Temple because I would have watched Donna's final episode when it airs, 2008, I guess. And by the time I did my pandemic pilgrimage rewatch, I started the classic series in October 2020, finished the classic series in November 2021. I did an ill-advised, overlong wilderness series project, watching way too many BBV stories, and an unfortunate attempt to watch all of Death Comes to Time, which I don't think has aged very well. When I finally got to the new series at the end of 21, beginning of 22, it amazed me how much I had forgotten. I had no recollection of the Temple Noble joke or Donna marrying Sean at all because I had never watched those episodes again after their original airing in 2008. So I had no recollection of him. And then when we got to the return in late 2023, I had forgotten Sean a second time. Just zero recollection in this head at all.
Oh, I got the order of the episodes wrong. I thought the werewolf kung fu monks was the season opener, but it was not. It came after, right? There were other things that I significantly misremembered or invented, like in New Earth when Cassandra has possessed Rose and they're having conversations. Like I completely swapped the order of those conversations, made up lines, like, and I guess it was. I was going to say it's not a long time ago. It is a long time ago, but I've seen these episodes more than once. So yes, it's weird. I don't know. I might be just getting old. It's part of it. It's part of it just too. It's like things go.
I mean, it's like asking you at age 29 to recall the specifics of shows that you watched casually when you were 11 years old. It's just not going to happen. I mean, I'll tell you this. I was a big fan of Different Strokes as much as anyone else when it was on in endless reruns in the mid to late 1980s. You would get home from school, and the Channel 5 in New York, which became a Fox affiliate, would show Different Strokes at 5, Different Strokes at 5:30, Too Close for Comfort at 6 every day for years. That's a lot of Different Strokes. So you see a lot of Conrad Bain. And then a few years later, when the 1991 Dark Shadows revival comes out, I went to the old-fashioned video store, and I rented the very first episode of Dark Shadows on a VHS. And I would have watched it, and I think I was completely unaware that Conrad Bain is in the very first episode of the 1966 Dark Shadows and has a recurring role that shows up 4 times over the first 2 years of the show. So when I started my Dark Shadows pilgrimage in 2023 and Conrad Bain from Different Strokes shows up in the first episode, I had no recollection of him being in it, even though I had watched the first episode of Dark Shadows contemporaneous to my big first wave of Different Strokes fandom.
I just, oh man, some of those 80, like I'm like you, like I remember coming home from school and watching like 4 hours of sitcoms from 2 years, like 20 years ago or something. A lot of them blur together for me.
I'll just
Um,
quickly, for my UK audience, Different Strokes was one of many sitcoms set in New York but filmed in Hollywood. It was the show where Conrad Bain plays a aging, rich, white millionaire New Yorker who lives in a penthouse duplex with a series of live-in housekeepers, and there's almost a different one for every year of the series. And he adopts the two African American orphan children of his previous housekeeper who dies off screen before the series begins. There were three child actors in the show: Dana Plato, Todd Bridges, and Gary Coleman. Each of the three child actors had terrible problems adjusting to adulthood after Different Strokes went off the air in the late 1980s following an 8-season run. Gary Coleman had an illness, and it stunted his growth, and he was a very small actor. He died fairly young. Dana Plato died pretty tragically of the combination of mental illness and drug overdose. Todd Bridges has managed to revive his career, but it's a show that's notable for child actors gone wrong. The show had a very young Janet Jackson in a recurring role as Todd Bridges' character's girlfriend. Nancy Reagan did a cameo on the show while she was still the First Lady, in an episode where Nancy Reagan wins the war on drugs, to paraphrase an Onion headline from retroactively much later on.
I remember that. I remember living through that in real time. Like the 80s were wild, man. Like our parents thought devil worshippers were meeting in the woods and sacrificing people, but it was always one town over. And like they believed this stuff. Like it's just crazy.
And Different Strokes did a couple of episodes about child abduction and molestation. They did it a couple of different times over the course of an 8 or 9 year run. In the 80s, you were always afraid of being abducted by total strangers, when, of course, the truth was it wasn't total strangers. It was usually close acquaintances or family members, usually in a religious or advisory capacity, who were being the abusers. But in the 80s, we were taught about stranger danger, which statistically turned out to not really be the case.
Yeah, those very those shows that would just completely change their tone for 1 week to do the very special episode. And so you think you're tuning into this family comedy, and it ends up being one of the darkest things you've ever watched, like with your family. And it's like they just when they dropped that, they dropped it hard. Like just no one's doing that today. No one's doing anything like that today.
Which brings us to the tragedy of the Ark. This is a story that has been pretty much maligned in fandom and in print media over the years for a variety of different reasons. Elizabeth Sandifer in TARDIS Eruditorum in 2011 savages both the Ark and Celestial Toymaker, the next story following, not to inadvertently bring the Savages into this, which is another Doctor Who serial coming up on TV that I've already covered on Doctor Who literature. I would have watched the Ark for the first time when I was probably 12, when the Hartnell package first came to America. And of course, nothing is better than TV that you watch at age 12, which is the same age when I was watching Different Strokes and reruns after school. I've always had a soft spot for the Ark, and I think the novelization is pretty good in how it adds textures and layers to the story, which I'll get to more specifically in my audio essay. So, when did you first see the Ark? How did you first react to the Ark? And how do you take to it today? I guess your kids will not quite have seen it yet because you're right up on top of it. But how do you expect that the girls are going to like this?
I don't think they're going to love it. Um, they can look past a degree of special effects in terms of the sets, the space scenes, that kind of stuff. They just look right past. It's a lot harder to look past the aliens when the design is really weak. And it doesn't get much weaker than this. Although I mean they're a little creepy, but I just think the younger one might get scared, and the older one is really narrowing in on the historicals. And she's just not. She just hasn't taken to any science fiction.
Huh.
So I don't know that they're going to love this. I don't have any memory of watching this episode when I was a kid, so it may not have been. I suspect my PBS station would do like a couple of first and then second Doctor episodes, and then just start repeating third and fourth and fifth over and over again. So I remember the Daleks. I remember Planet of Giants. I don't remember much else from really the entire black and white era. So the first time I would have watched this would have been when I watched every episode in order in college. And none of that has really stuck with me either, because I think I was really just racing through these black and whites. Because I remember at that time, it's all reconstructions. There's no animations, right? So I'm blazing through those to try to, get to the good stuff. I didn't think I had an appreciation for it. So like series 3, like season 3, I'm more or less experiencing a lot of this for the first time. And certainly reading the novels for the first time, right? The reconstructions are good, but I don't know how good they would be if I hadn't read the novel the day before. Like I'm literally watching the reconstructions with the novel fresh in my mind, and I'm like, wow, these are great. I can totally follow what's going on. Well, of course you can. Like you know what's going to happen. So I don't know how those play to someone who's going in cold, which is to just say that you should really read all the novelizations for the missing episodes. Like, I think that when we talk about, one of the questions I ask the kids in the podcast is, okay, you've read the book, you've seen the episode. Like, is it worth it for someone to read the book? And the answer is, if the only thing you have is a reconstruction, it is always worthwhile to read these books. And this one especially, like this one fills in a lot of blanks, but I definitely picked up on this sort of first 2 episodes are fine, and then it gets really weird with the monoids in the second 2 episodes in a way that's uncomfortable.
That was Elizabeth Sandifer's point in TARDIS Eruditorum, because you can't tell if the story is meant to be progressive, as in humans should not be treating monoids this way, or as if Sandifer is pointing out, this is more of a white man's burden story where the whole point is you can't trust the monoids at all. And when they're finally put in charge, they're rubbish at it. I tend to go with the former point because the novelization, I think, definitely takes the former point. Nothing inherently wrong with the monoids, and the way the humans treat them is the humans' own fault. So mankind is the enemy in the story. I think the book leans into that. Just to go back to the meta point, though, the Hartnell package, when it comes to PBS starting in 1985, is 17 serials, because those are the only ones that were complete out of Hartnell. And you go direct from Time Meddler to the Ark, to the Gunfighters, to the War Machines. If you are a kid watching black and white in PBS once a week without a copy of the program guide, you have most of the first 2 seasons preserved, and then you only have 3 serials left from season 3 at all, and nothing at all from season 4 at that time. Orphan episodes we wouldn't have had a chance to watch because they weren't available commercially. In the States, we were not on the bootleg circuit that allowed British fans to see nth generation copies of, say, Underwater Menace Part 3 in the 1980s, or audio recordings of Marco Polo. I had the Leficia program guide, and I got that pretty early on in my fandom, so I was able to follow along, and I knew what happened to Vicky. I knew she stayed behind in ancient Greece, and I knew that Dodo was a short-lived character who was introduced in the last 4 minutes of the massacre. And I had some of the novelizations would have come out by the time that I saw this on TV in early 1986. We didn't know how much that we were missing because we didn't have the transcripts or the telesnaps or the recons or the animations. If you're watching it now, there's a lot of recons to sit through between Galaxy 4 and the Massacre. But just watching this on TV in 1985, going straight from Time Meddler to this, has to be an element of culture shock. Also, I don't think I would have appreciated the visual evolution of Doctor Who. Douglas Camfield is a great director, and he does great things in Time Meddler. But what Michael Imeson does in this story with camera angles and trick photography and the use of video monitors on camera, this is a huge visual evolution for Doctor Who. And Imeson spent so much time and money that he was never invited back to direct for the show again. But it is a remarkable bit of directing. And in fact, when the first Doctor Handbook comes out in the mid-1990s, David J. Howe, Stammers, and Walker, this was the story that got a full chapter-long breakdown because Michael Imeson's directing is so inventive.
I agree completely. And I was wondering does it feel this way because there's just so many episodes in a row that are missing? And I don't think so, because we have a couple from Dalek's Master Plan. And then so it's like this, the way that, and another Doctor Who director said this, I don't remember who it was, but he was talking about how you were always going to be on the soundstage, but there's no way to make a soundstage look like anything other than a soundstage unless you build another floor on top of it. And so if you go back and watch his episodes, like in the Tom Baker era, they're constantly on like the bridges of ships and things that have been built on top of that soundstage. And they do some of that here. There's a lot of extras here, more than you would need to get away with in one of these stories,
including children.
And yeah, and the the space scenes of them going to and from the planet aren't terrible, but the book was quite a bit more ambitious. Like the book has those scenes where they're visiting like every different biodome, right? So they go to the polar area and the desert area. And I remember reading that. I'm like, I can promise you this is not going to be in the episode because there's no way they attempted to shoot this. There's also there's one thing I don't like in these early Doctor Who stories. And usually it's the show and the book that does it. But in this case, it's just the book, which is where they just repeat a plot element. And in the book, the Doctor and his companions get arrested and convicted and sentenced to death. And then they get released to work on the virus. And then they solve it and then they leave in the show. But in the book, they have to get arrested again a second time.
I am going to make a larger point about that when I do my audio essay, because that lands a lot better now, post-COVID, because we saw the way that the organized opposition to mask mandates, the organized violent opposition to social distancing, which it turns out was a dress rehearsal for January 6th, the organized opposition to the vaccine, and the way that certain members of Congress are even to this day trying to have Dr. Fauci accused of war crimes. Zentos pretty much encapsulates that because he has his ARC police following the Doctor, and we have the Doctor being accused of a vaccine that is killing people and making things worse, and it's completely backwards and it's wrong. And the only unrealistic element of the book is that Zentos sees reason and is made to change his mind within a matter of pages, whereas in real life we are still dealing with organized vaccine resistance, one of whom is currently a candidate for United States president, referring, of course, to RFK Jr. So I think it's important that this stuff is in the book because now that we have lived through a real-life plague, we see that people like Zentos are the norm, not the exception.
Yeah, there's a little bit lost from the performances, and the two of them are Zentos and then the Guardian in the first two episodes, because the Guardian's performance, and I didn't pick this up in the book, he's a little slimy, like there's something just not quite right with him, and that reinforces the disparity in the relationship between the Monads and the humans. And then so you don't see that in the book. And yeah, Zentos seems like a nutter in the book because he keeps, even when it's very clear that the Doctor is helping people, he still tries to throw him out of an airlock.
Twice, right.
Yeah, I feel like the author wanted the episode to end with the message that you have to learn to live together as equals on this planet. But he couldn't bring himself to portray the humans as equally culpable in their disagreements, right? Like, and maybe this is probably me reading too much into like the current political climate, but it's sort of that don't upset the moderate approach to liberalism when it's like, yes, you've got the humans and the monoids, and when each of them are in power, there's just no comparison. Like one is so much clearly better than the other. Like imagine this story if when the Doctor went 700 years into the future, the monoids and the humans had simply reversed their roles. So the monoids went on top, but they were still very polite about it. Like no one's getting whipped, and the humans just say they're fine to serve. And then imagine our companions having to react to that, because Dodo and Steven would have been like, this isn't right. And the Doctor would have been like, well, you didn't have a problem with it when it was reversed, so why should I intervene now? Like that would have been an amazing story, but they weren't ready for that in 66.
And I'll come back to this again in the audio essay. There are a lot more signposts in the first 4 chapters of the novelization, covering episodes 1 and 2, that the monoids are much smarter than the humans think, and the humans are blind to these signs, and what the humans are doing is clearly misuse, if not abuse, of a superior alien culture. That is not, I think, brought out as much on TV, possibly due to lack of resources and lack of time. So the boa constrictor scene, which I'll come to in the audio essay, the Doctor quickly realizes that the monoids are much more clever and in some ways possibly smarter than humans, because in the book, it is a monoid who basically develops the actual proper winning vaccine formula, building on the Doctor's work. So it's a tragedy in the book that the humans assume the monoids are a subservient class when the monoids are actually intellectually superior. That's, I think, the point of the book. Doesn't quite come across on television.
Yeah, I'm trying to think here, because the Guardians can't even be bothered to see the Doctor off, right? It's the monoids who have to drive him in their little go-kart
right
to the TARDIS. And there was this other difference that I think is kind of important between the book and the show, because in the show, when we see the finished statue, it is human all the way up to the neck. But in the book, he goes to the trouble to say that the arms are reptilian, which sets a different date for when this revolution would have happened. But it's easy to imagine it. You know, you imagine fallouts from this virus that are terrible. The invention of their ability to communicate, and then the invention of the gun. You can completely see how this society would have turned over on its head. I just think it was a choice to make the monoids so horrible and the humans look like angels in comparison that I think undercuts the message of the episode.
We'll hear from Jim Sangster a little bit later in the program. He says there's a point in the book where it says that the one in charge of the monoids in the second half of the story is the 16th or 17th generation of one. Quick back of the envelope math, assuming a generation is still 25 years, that means the monoids have been in control for more than 400 years, which is more than half the lifespan of the Ark, which was a 700-year colony ship journey.
Yeah. That's the other thing when you get, and I had the same thought about Galaxy 4, because when you get to read from the point of view of the villains in the book, it becomes less a story about the humans versus the monoids and more about the humans versus this number one. Like that guy's the worst. And it's his leadership and his influence over a select number of others that is leading to disaster. It's not all of them. And it was the exact same thing in Galaxy 4, because Galaxy 4 made it a lot clear that all the other women on that ship were not just clones, but like clones that did not have the mental capacity that the leader had.
Right, they were drones with a single function and no independent autonomy.
Yeah. And so that woman, the leader, is there alone, essentially alone. She has no one she can really talk to. And the book strongly suggests that she was given this assignment because she just pissed everyone off where she's from and sent her away. So it becomes less. So there's a lot of like really dark readings into that story about how it's an allegory against feminism. But if you read the book, it's really just about this one person who's awful that they run into.
In my
And
Galaxy 4 episode, I read out some quotes that Mark from Trap 1 found for me that William Ems, the author of Galaxy 4, had stated about women in interviews. And this was not a very enlightened individual. Whereas I think Paul Erickson is a little more what we would consider now in the 2020s to be socially progressive and aware. But it doesn't always come across on TV because some of the stuff that he wanted to do in the book doesn't ever happen on television. And then another point, of course, about the visuals. This is a great visual leap forward for Doctor Who. We are missing, of course, the spacewalk scene in Dalek's Master Plan, which prompted Stanley Kubrick from the set of 2001 to call Douglas Campion and say, how did you do that? I want to borrow that same trick for myself. So we, of course, didn't have that when this came out in the 1980s. I think it's referring to episode 5 of Dalek's Master Plan, which we can now see commercially. It's finally been released. It did survive, but if you're watching Doctor Who in the 80s, you go right from Time Meddler to this. The direction looks that incredible.
yeah, I'm season 3 is not as like people dump on season 3 too much, and it's because of the companions, and that's justified. But this is William Hartnell's best season. He's given way more to do. There's a scene in the Daleks Master Plan where he literally says to them, "Look, I'm the leader. Like, have you guys not figured out whose show this is? Like Brett Vion's trying to be in charge for like 2 or 3 episodes, but finally it's like, it's Doctor Who. And at least so far hasn't turned back. Now I understand, his illness is going to take a toll and he's going to be missing more episodes the further along we get. But like from the moment Ian leaves, he becomes the lead.
Right.
And it's more fun. Like seasons 1 and 2 are more heady. But season 3, if you're the Hartnell fan more than you are a Barbara fan, and I'm a huge Barbara fan and the kids are too, but like this is like seeing him continue to lose, seeing him lose patience with these young companions who are just driving him nuts through no fault of their own it's a very accurate portrayal of old people back before like they became the worst, right? Before they started voting as a block. But like, this is your your favorite grandparent.
Hartnell is best in comedy episodes going up against human or recognizably humanoid villains. He is terrific in the Gunfighters. He is terrific in the Romans. And then you have this run of stories, as you and your kids pointed out with Dalek's Master Plan, the moment where we start to lose Hartnell as an active contributor to the production team begins with Dalek's Master Plan episode 11, The Abandoned Planet. On TV, he's there in the very beginning and then disappears almost without explanation until much deeper into the story. Similar to what happens with Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor in 73 Yards. No spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, but that was intentionally constructed to be a Dr. Light episode because Ncuti Gatwa has many other obligations that RTD couldn't work around. With Hartnell, it was because the production team was trying to get rid of him. And then in The Massacre, he is gone for half the story. His dual role as the Abbot is not really a dual role because the Abbot's only in a handful of scenes and has less than 100 words of dialogue tops. The Ark at least has Hartnell across all 4 episodes, but then Celestial Toymaker, again, he's gone for almost all of the story. Gunfighters, he's there for all 4 episodes and is glorious because it's a comedy with other human actors. And then right after that, in The Savages, he disappears again, spending almost all of episode 3 on camera, but strapped to a board and not uttering a word. The Ark at least preserves Hartnell in all his glory, but I'm not positive this is his best work because it's a science fiction story with a lot of technical dialogue. And instead of sharing scenes with great British comedy actors like Peter Butterworth in Dalek's Master Plan, he's sharing his screen with Dodo, who is not beloved by large elements of fandom, even though I think she's terrific. I'm a Jackie Lane apologist. He spends a lot of time with the Monoid, which is a non-speaking extra in a rubber mask. And then in episode 4, he spends a lot of time with an empty chair standing in for an invisible Refusian. So this is not really a story that tests his acting abilities, and it's not really a showcase for everything William Hartnell brings to the role.
It also has him just like, going to the lab to solve the problem for an episode that they've done before. This is also the second time this season that they're going to the invisible alien well, because they
Right.
just can't afford to do a second alien, so they just say it's invisible. Like that's real lame to do that so close to when you did it in the Daleks master plan.
And at least in Dalek's master plan, Douglas Camfield is working around this by showing us footprints, and when the Dalek exterminates, there is a visual effect. Here, Michael Imeson had already busted the budget on the sets and the video screen, so he had nothing left for a stray feather or talon.
Uh, the my pick right now for the episode I would most like to see returned
Yeah.
is the Myth Makers, and it is actually for Hartnell's performance in that, because I think it
Mm-hmm.
sounds really good. And I think him, because he spends that entire story with Odysseus, right?
Going up against, I think, Ivor Salter, who was in a few Doctor Who's, and Francis de Wolf coming back from Keys of Marinus. But in Keys of Marinus, he and Hartnell weren't in the same episode. Here, the Doctor and Agamemnon have some great confrontations in episode one.
Yes, it's by the end of that episode, he's so sick of Odysseus,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not because Odysseus is an idiot. He's the smartest person there. He's like the only one who sizes up the Doctor immediately, but they are stylistically so polar opposite that they cannot stand each other. And I that episode 4 is the one I want to see of the Myth Makers.
Again, I love the Hartnell Doctor. I think William Hartnell is criminally underrated in the role. The things that people tend to remember him for, like forgetting his lines, is not really evident. And I think on camera, when he is in a story that he clearly likes, like a comedy historical, there's really nobody better. There's so many more facets to the Doctor than he's given credit for. I like the arc. I'm trying to say nice things about it. I don't think this is the best showcase for William Hartnell's particular talents. And as the show goes harder sci-fi in season four, you can see why Innes Lloyd was ready to replace it with Patrick Troughton.
Yeah, although I will say, like, there were some flubs in this episode, and they weren't his. Those guest starring humans, guardians, like I, I I remember that they tell this story, and I don't know how many times they did it, but like if they flubbed it, they just kept going. But if the actor really wasn't happy with it, they would just swear, and then they would be forced to redo it.
Right.
Uh,
That's a John Pertweeism.
yeah, and I just thought like it is that is the weirdest thing on this rewatch, is that they just sent that out on the air, like even by the time of I Love Lucy in like America, like that would be just unheard of, I think. Um, but they're on a budget that boggles the mind.
I Love Lucy launches Lucille Ball as a producer, power broker in Hollywood with Desilu Studios. She basically invents the multi-camera, Hollywood-bound American sitcom, which is an art form that dominated for decades afterwards. She also, along with Desi Arnaz, basically launched Star Trek and The Twilight Zone. So Lucille Ball is almost the mother of American TV science fiction.
Yeah, where are you right now on the new series? So we're recording this the day after 73 yards, right?
I was out at a minor league baseball game last night with one of my dad friends. And my daughter waited up on a Friday night because she really wanted to watch. We're doing an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer every day. Then last night we were up to Crush, the season 5 episode where Drusilla returns alongside Spike, Juliet Landau. We watched the first 10 minutes of that, and then Hulu crashed. We had this software problem with Hulu. I tried rebooting the internet. I tried turning on and turning off the TV, tried signing out of Hulu and signing back in. Couldn't get anything to work. So we started to watch Doctor Who instead. But at this point, it's already 11:30 at night. So she fell asleep about 15 minutes in. So we paused it and we finished this morning. We finally fixed the problem with Hulu. So we finished Crush. We then finished 73 Yards. And then we watched the Buffy episode, I Was Made to Love You, which starts off as a comedy episode about a sex robot and turns into a dark tragedy with a major cast member dying in the very last scene. Again, trying to avoid specific spoilers. So we watched a lot of emotionally charged television this morning. She is watching the new series with me. She really likes Millie Gibson, and she was impressed that Millie Gibson was doing all this heavy dramatic work as Ruby as a 17-year-old actor. So my kid likes the new series. However, she likes Buffy a lot more. And after the emotional gut punch of the end of the last Buffy episode that we watched, we went out for a 30-minute walk, and we talked a lot more about Buffy and hardly anything about Doctor Who. She's enjoying the series, but it doesn't have the emotional impact for her that Buffy does, and it doesn't have the emotional impact for me that classic Doctor Who had when I was her age. That being said, I think 73 Yards is far and away the best of the 4 episodes of this season, although I don't think there's a lot of competition. And there were things about it that I wasn't quite clear on. I read one online review which said that 73 Yards ends because RTD ran out of page space and couldn't think of a proper ending, so just waved his hand and said, "It's over now." I can't say that I disagree with that criticism, but I think 73 Yards is remarkably good. It's part of the darker, older, more mature RTD who stopped making all the fat jokes that characterized the new series in 2005. I'm not positive it's the best Doctor Who ever made, but I think it is the best episode of this season so far. I'll do a brief audio review of it at the end of this podcast hour. How about you? What are you up to?
We're we're 8 episodes into the RTD2 era, right? We've got 3 Tenet specials, a Christmas special, and 4 episodes of this season. Although I don't know that Disney Plus is doing us any favors by putting the Christmas special as episode 1 of this season, but I don't know. But like,
right,
of those 8 episodes, a full half of them are 10 out of 10 brilliant Doctor Who right up until the end of the episode. And then they fall apart to varying degrees. It's also, it's just, we're on the precipice of greatness. Like this could have been an all-time run, but like, you have to, like Star Beast is trying to undo the Meta Crisis Doctor, which was a dumb idea. So it's going to have a dumb resolution, but like, you got to do better than that. And like the giggle's divisive. Some people liked it. I think people who had seen Ncuti Gatwa in a lot of other stuff seem to like it a lot more than those like myself who either haven't seen him or deliberately avoided seeing him once he was cast as the Doctor. I do this every time. When someone's cast in Doctor Who, they're excommunicado. I'm not watching anything with them in it. I want Doctor Who to be the first thing I see with them in it.
I am curious what Elizabeth and Josie are going to make of the giggle if you show it to them right after the Celestial Toymaker.
I find the end of the giggle genuinely embarrassing as a Doctor Who fan, and I don't know if I will show it to them. And that's a strong take because a lot of people really like it. But when fandom's been asking this question for the last 10 years, is do we need the post regeneration crisis episode, or is it just a thing that we've inherited from the old show and we keep doing because the showrunners are Doctor Who fans? We have the answer. We do need it. We need to be introduced to the new Doctor in some way. Having Ncuti Gatwa just pop out and start being the Doctor instantly is neck breaking. And the catch thing, like nothing about the last 15 minutes of that episode works at all. And then you get to the Devil's Chord. Devil's Chord is amazing, but that episode is leading to a Beatles song. Like he wrote that, like I'm convinced he had the rights up until the last minute. That episode is written to the conclusion of a Beatles song. And if you can't get the Beatles, get anyone else. Dude, imagine if that had been an ELO episode and they had gone back and it had been like a spiritual sequel to Love and Monsters. Like how good would that have been? But you have to end the episode with an absolute banger. And that song is not good. Like that song's bad. I'm sorry. Like there's always a twist. And it's funny if you know the twist thing.
Right. With Susan Twist being in the episode and it being a twist. My daughter's a 13-year-old American teenager, okay? She doesn't know very much about the Beatles. Her generation doesn't have much to say to the Beatles. It's totally different language, totally different time. They're just from the distant past for her. She was watching the episode for Millie Gibson, and her point is that the episode builds up the importance of Millie Gibson as the only person in 1963 time who has any recollection of music. If music is going to be saved, then Ruby Sunday is the character to do it. Instead, at the end of the episode, they contrive to lock her in a cello where she is suffocating, even though she's clearly breathing through a very large air hole. And the Beatles, who, let's face it, they're only minor characters in the story, they manage to come in and save the day. And you get the two shot of John and Paul playing the piano and rediscovering rock and roll on their own. From my daughter's point of view, she wanted that to be Ruby's story, not John and Paul's story. And it ends up being John and Paul's story. The episode also, I think, mistakes the importance of the Beatles and the evolution of music, because if music disappears in 1926 and doesn't come back until 1963, in real life, you've lost the entirety of the jazz age, you've lost big band swing, you've lost Glenn Miller, you've lost the Southern blues that became rock and roll, because rock and roll was not fully formed, invented by white people. It had to be, I don't want to say stolen, but they took a lot of rhythm and blues music.
Appropriated is the word that the kids use.
But we lose 40 years of incredible pop music that RTD's script assumes never happened at all. There were a lot of building blocks that made the Beatles the Beatles. This episode rips all those building blocks away and pretends that the Beatles reinvent rock and roll out of whole cloth in 1963. It wasn't meant to be appropriation. It's meant to be a love letter to the Beatles. And as a love letter to the Beatles, that's fine. I am not a huge Beatles fan. But looking at it from a distance, knowing everything that got erased and the Beatles save it all, I think that's a sour note. Kind of, not a huge sour note, but I think it's something that's worth discussing.
There's definitely a sort of like, I'm sure there's like a deep cultural pride in the UK for the Beatles,
right?
In a way that I don't think America, like, you know, we had all the other best bands, right? They had the Beatles. Like I think that's maybe, first of all, seems kind of clear he wanted it to be this year so that he could mention Susan, right? I don't think you mention Susan unless you're doing it for a reason, because that's such a weird thing to introduce the new viewers to. So,
and we have not seen the last 4 episodes yet. We don't know if that is going to be coming.
I will say, like, generally, this feels like a season that is putting a lot of weight on its conclusion in a way that other seasons didn't, right? Like, he's paused his episodes at the height of the emotional arc to have it snow and talk about how special people on the internet are mean. They've been calling her blonde Clara. I think that's a little unfair, but he's done that several times now, where it's just like, time out. This season's going somewhere and it's going to be big. And he's really hyped up The One Who Waits, right? Because the toy maker's talking about how he bested the master, he bested the elementals. Like, no one can beat him except this one person who's waited. And it's like, there's only a couple names that could be that aren't terribly disappointing, right? And like, sorry, but a villain from the Sarah Jane Adventures is not one of them. Like, no. This needs to be Fenric or Omega, or maybe Susan. She's waiting for him to come back and visit her. I don't know, but like, the conclusion needs to be strong here. I think. I don't know that I don't know that we have got an all-time great season up 4 episodes in.
I don't want to take anything away from Jinx Monsoon. Jinx Monsoon does incredibly over-the-top work in The Devil's Court. I think it's too soon to have the toy maker's child only 2 episodes in real time after the giggle. However, if we end up watching all 9 episodes from Church on Ruby Road all the way to whatever the finale is named, I'm avoiding episode titles and spoilers. If we watch all 9 of those in 9 days at the end of the year, maybe it will make a lot more sense. Maybe it's thematic. For right now, it seems a little bit of an odd thing to have a sequel to The Giggle only 2 episodes after The Giggle.
I think the legacy of The Devil's Court will be the introduction of that character, who I hope returns several more times. But like, bring them back with the music rights to whatever you're going to do. And then like, give them a better motivation, because as soon as they say like, hey, I just want to kill everyone in the universe and then listen to the trees, it's like, oh, okay, so you're just a monster that we have to defeat no matter what. Like, you could have said something interesting about music and people's, I don't know if I was in college radio when I was in college, and there were a lot of people who like couldn't admit to ever liking anything that was popular, right? So you could say something interesting about people's like unhealthy relationship with music, if that's a thing. I don't know. Like once they said like I just want to kill everyone, that's the point when the episode starts to go downhill. It's actually not when the Beatles song fails to materialize. It's when the character ceases to have a motivation that makes them interesting. Because then if their motivation is interesting, they can have an interesting relationship with the Doctor. But if you just want to kill everyone in the universe, you can't have a relationship with the Doctor. Like, it doesn't work. And I think especially these two, like, it would be great to maybe not see the Master for a while and just have the Shutigatwa face off against the Maestro once every season.
And you could argue, of course, that the Maestro is a play on Master, so there would have been room to have that as the newest iteration of the Master. But of course, since it is now an immortal who is from the same family tree as the toy maker, that possibility has been foreclosed. You can't have the Maestro and the Master in the same season, though, can you?
I think RTD did that to mess with us. I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he called it the Maestro, and he wanted us to guess. And so that's the least. I mean, I have a problem with the way RTD has dealt with fandom, like in the past. Like, and we talked about Love and Monsters earlier. I think that's a really great episode if you don't know what it's actually about. But the second you know what it's about, it's extremely mean-spirited. 73 yards.
The reading of the Absorbaloff as Ian Levine, right?
Sure, but like, even if you don't, like, yeah, saying that specifically about a person is just cruel. But like, taking that away, it passes judgment on like certain kind of fans. I kind of feel like that was the same thing with like 73 yards. It's like 73 yards seems to take a perverse pleasure in explaining as little as possible. It's like, oh, you're one of those fans who thinks Doctor Who should make sense? Well, take this. And it's like, maybe I'm reading too much into what he's done in the past, but like, Doctor Who's not at a level of strength where we can afford to be poking people in the eye, right? These fans have shown an irrational amount of loyalty to stay with the show for the last 10 years. Like, we don't need to tell them that they're fanning wrong.
My daughter understood 73 yards as it was proceeding a lot more than I did. She guessed the identity of the 73-yard person a lot earlier than I did. She understood exactly what Ruby was doing at the football pitch in Cardiff long before I understood it. I had to go to Wikipedia and read the plot summary to give me an assist. Again, I am old now. I'm over 50. I am no longer part of the show's fan base. The show is being written to people with a better understanding of television than me because they are watching much more cutting-edge TV. And my frame of reference is to spend 10 minutes of this podcast talking about Different Strokes, which launched in 1978. If my daughter understands it, if I didn't, I'm happy. That's where the show should be. However, I would like to keep watching the show, and I've been asking all my guests the same questions that Darren Mooney asks everyone on the 250. The 250 is a podcast geared towards the IMDb top 250 movies of all time. I did an episode on Doctor Who's top 60 for the first 60 years, so I asked all my guests for the story of the week, does this episode belong on the list of the 60 greatest Doctor Who stories ever made? I am asking that same question of Church on Ruby Road. The answer is no. I'm asking that same question of Space Babies. Not only is it a no, but for me, Space Babies is the worst Doctor Who episode of all time. Not in the sense that it's actively bad, but I don't like bodily function humor. And that episode is so steeped in it, I can tell you I will never want to watch it again, which is the worst thing I can say about a Doctor Who episode. Devil's Court, I do not think is a top 60 episode. There are some obvious fixes, but what we get, not a top 60. People like Boom more than I did. For me, it is not a top 60. 73 yards is potentially a top 60, the way that Turn Left and Midnight are arguably top 60 stories, but I've only seen it in full 6 hours ago, so I'm not prepared to answer that question yet. So for me, 73 yards is the only story in the Shutigawa era that is potentially a top 60. I don't know how you feel.
Let me pull up these numbers really quick. Because I was wondering, like, how much is 60 out of like all of Doctor Who, right? Like, what percentage are we talking about? And it's roughly like top 20%. So you're basically saying that anything that's not in the top 60, you're giving a score of less than 80 out of 100.
Okay.
Oh man, that's really hard. They're real close. I feel like Boom and Devil's Cord are just outside. I think they're really close. I think 73 yards might actually be closer. I think 73 yards. Last time I was here, we were talking about the 50th anniversary poll and the 60th anniversary poll, and we played that bisexual hold game, which I have your scores for. But it's kind of interesting that there's a recency bias, and it goes in both directions. So, like in the 50th anniversary, there was a lot of like really recent stuff. Like Series 10 was ranked pretty highly, and that didn't last. But then the Jodie Whittaker era in the 60th is the opposite. Like her episodes are shockingly low. And I suspect they'll go up. So I just think the polarization of the moment affects those polls.
I am consciously aware of this. I used to call it the fallacy of the moment, although recency bias is a much better way of putting it. In 1994, when I was on Rec Arts Doctor Who, and Shannon Patrick Sullivan, who will be on the show fairly soon. Hi, Shannon. When Shannon was keeping the rankings of the best new adventures as they came out, any book that came out in 1994 was going to automatically debut in the top 10 of the new adventure rankings. And there were a lot of weaker books that came out that year. And in the final analysis, I think very few of 1994's Doctor Who New Adventures would be in the top tier. And there ended up only being 61 of those. I try not to immediately give a new episode a high score just because it's a new episode. My top 60 does include a lot of old stories that objectively will not be included on anybody else's top 60. I have Paradise Towers in my top 60. Took a while to get there. I have Curse of Peladon in my top 60. I don't think a lot of people are going to be doing that. I have Creature from the Pit and Delta and the Bannerman in my top 60. For a lot of people, those are bottom tier stories. I have a lot more classic series than new series stories than I do in my top 60. Because for me, I have an older bias. I really like the space that Curse of Peladon has, and I like the story that it's telling. And because I first watched it at the same time that I was watching Masterpiece Theater over my mother's shoulder, I like what Curse of Peladon is trying to do. The newer stories aren't landing for me the way that Curse of Peladon lands. I think objectively, in every objective sense, Boom is a much better story than Curse of Peladon. But for me, I think Curse of Peladon ranks higher. And this is, of course, a very personal thing. I will also say that if you go to the top 250 tracker, there's an app that tracks the top 250 IMDb every single day. You can go back to April 29th, 1996 and see what was in the top 250. On the day the 250 premieres on IMDb in 1996, 2 Wallace and Gromit shorts are in the top 16 of all time. They have long since fallen out. So you can see how the evolution of the internet means that we are hearing from more voices now than we were hearing in 1996, when most of the internet were Wallace and Gromit aficionados. So the rankings change over time. For me, only 73 Yards has a shot at ever being in my top 60 as other stories fall away. How about you?
I've never really compared the episodes across the eras. I've done one of those lists. I've treated them separately. I'm guessing they would be close to equal, because I think whenever I do a top 10 or top 20, they're pretty close to equal. It's interesting. The Ark comes in at 34, which is not awful.
Huh.
Like that's again, it was 25 10 years ago. But that's, it's not in the bottom third. Like it's not terrible.
When I first compiled my top 60, I went through the entire episode guide from Unearthly through Power of the Doctor. And I said, do I like this story a lot? I'm putting it on my short list. I ended up with a short list, I think, of 99 stories. So Bubbling Under for Hartnell, the Aztec was Bubbling Under. I ended up removing it because there are other historicals I wanted to feature. I put the Sensorites in my top 60 because I am a Sensorites apologist. It ended up falling out. It's a Bubbling Under. Same with the Chase, same with the War Machines. The Ark is not even in my Bubbling Under list. So the very first rough draft of my top 60 that had 99 stories, the Ark was not on it. I think the Ark has a lot going for it. I think it failed, but I think it is a noble failure.
It's funny. As a kid watching Doctor Who, I kept wanting him to use the damn time machine. Like, I'm like, you, like, because there was this one episode where it's like, oh man, we don't have time to develop this solution. I'm like, you can go in the TARDIS and take as long as you want and just come back in 1 minute. And he, and so finally we get an episode that does something interesting with time travel. And it's like, it's not quite what I was looking for. Like, but it was also like the exact same thing with Star Trek: The Next Generation. But with Star Trek: The Next Generation, the thing that I was always wanting is like a shootout with the Romulans. They got this big ship. They're always talking about phasers and photon torpedoes. They mention them every episode. They're like, what if we use the phasers? And like, no, we can't do that. And then, you turn on the TV and Star Trek: The Next Generation would have like the 90-second intro and then run the credits.
Right.
And so you watch this episode, and in the conclusion of the pre-intro is this giant Romulan warbird decloaking, and it's like, okay, finally, there's no way we're gonna fight the Romulans, and it's like, no, we're gonna do diplomacy for 45 minutes. But that's why it was a good show, like, because you don't want to do what the 13-year-old wants to do, like I wouldn't trade any of those episodes, and it's the same thing with Doctor Who. You're talking about the kids, like. My kids are also very good about figuring out the plot. What they're not good at is figuring out the parts that you're not supposed to like care about or ask questions.
Right.
So like, and maybe it's because I've seen the episodes, but it's like, even with the newer episodes, like, yeah, you're not supposed to worry about it. It's Doctor Who. It's not that kind of show. And they haven't quite figured out what are the things you're supposed to ignore. And it's just sort of like, once you listen to enough stories, you just kind of know. I don't want to spoil this, but did you watch the Colin Farrell PI show on Apple TV?
Apple TV is one of the few streaming services that I don't pay for, so I have not seen it. It's
Okay.
a walled garden that I just haven't to throw my grappling hook across the wall yet.
Okay, if you can abscond with someone's password, that's one you want to watch unspoiled.
What's the name of that series?
It's called Sugar because that's his name.
Heard people talking about that on my social media, which right now is limited to Facebook and Threads. So
you're not on Blue Sky? You got to get on Blue Sky, man.
I am on Blue Sky. Blue Sky, I try and separate out my personal stuff with my fandom stuff. So I don't put my fandom stuff on Threads. I do have a curated channel on Facebook for Doctor Who fandom, and I only release my podcast links and Doctor Who thoughts to that limited audience. Blue Sky right now solely exists as a replacement for what Twitter was, and I only use that to distribute episodes of Doctor Who Lit, but I don't have the time to read Blue Sky as much as I read Facebook and Threads or even Instagram to an extent. So right now, Facebook is only used as a podcast delivery system, but I'm not engaging with it the way that I should be.
But I mean, my engagement with Blue Sky is entirely Doctor Who. None of my other interests have migrated there in any great number, but I don't I still lurk on Twitter. I don't remember the last time anyone said anything interesting about Doctor Who on Twitter, but like a lot of very big, luminaries, for lack of a better word, in fandom are on Blue Sky and talking every day. And it's incredibly interesting. It's a little behind the scenes, like for me, like there's a certain kind of Who, like this is a great thread actually on Blue Sky. Someone was talking about how the difference between Star Trek fans and Doctor Who fans. And they were telling the story that there was a Star Trek themed pub quiz and all the questions were about stuff in universe. And one of the questions was about who wrote a specific episode. And all the Star Trek fans were like, you can't ask that. That's not about Star Trek. And Doctor Who is the polar opposite, right? Doctor Who fans don't memorize any of the technical jargon about the TARDIS, but they've memorized the 2-letter codes of each episode. Like they can tell you who didn't invite who to lunch in the 80s and how that led to the show's cancellation years later. Like it's crazy, the stuff that just, I mean, these are mega fans, but it's like, they're referencing individual memos that Sidney Newman sent to justify their view on Doctor Who. And it's like, it's this weird appeal to authority. And I'm not saying that shouldn't fan that way because it's interesting, but it's trivia. I've been trying to avoid any behind the scenes stuff. There's so many interviews now. We've got the Doctor Who behind the scenes program back after each episode. I don't watch them. I don't care what the creators of the show have to say about the show. I only care about what the show is saying. But that makes it really hard to talk to anyone about it because everyone else wants to talk about, well, Russell T Davies said this in this interview, so this is what it means, and this is what the ratings are doing, so that means the show's good or bad or whatever. And it's like everyone's trying to look for evidence in places other than the show itself. It's like, not to pick on a certain kind of fan, but there's those people who are like, oh, you can call a character Doctor Who because in the credits it says Doctor Who. And my answer to that is like, or you could just watch the show. Like, I asked my 7-year-old what the character's name was, and she got it right. And it's not because she read the credits, it's because she just watched the show. And it's like, there's so much stuff interesting in the show that I think you lose if there's just a right answer and it's what someone said in an interview. This is so boring. And other fandoms don't seem to have that problem. And I don't know what it is.
When I was younger, I had 24 hours in a day. I have the same 24 hours in a day now, but I have much less time for fandom than I would have when I was in my early 20s and single. I don't talk about it on the show, but I have a full-time career that takes up a lot of my day between my job and my work friends. I have a 13-year-old. You have 2 daughters. That also takes up a significant amount of our spare time. When I was younger, I could memorize all the story codes, and I had time for all the behind-the-scenes stuff. Now, my friends are digging into the David Brunt First Doctor production diary, which has just come out, in a way that I would dig into the latest Michael Chabon novel. I have not ordered that book yet. I need to. I'm sure I would love it because I love that sort of behind-the-scenes trivia. But I don't have time to both read the David Brunt production diary and do all the other stuff that I like and do behind the scenes for the new series. So I'm just not paying as much attention to the new series because I'm doing this podcast on the old series, and my kid and I are watching a 25-year-old series every single day, Buffy, and we spend a lot of time talking about that. Now, I am on Blue Sky. You and I follow each other, and I have your account up on my phone, and I want to say that your last post on Blue Sky is one of the greatest things I've seen. Quote, I genuinely love that the show's solution for making Millie Gibson look 40 is to give her spectacles and a glass of wine. That is the commentary that I want. That is what I am here for. I'm also going to say that for me, the best part of Doctor Who is the opening titles. When I think about what the Peter Howell music and the Starfield Peter Davison opening did for me as an 11-year-old discovering Doctor Who, the adrenaline rush of the opening credits is a large part of the show for me. When you take away the opening credits from the show, that hurts me. Sleep No More, I didn't like, in part because there are no opening credits. I had a hard time adjusting to The Woman Who Fell to Earth because I was waiting for the opening credits, and we didn't have them. This episode was so good that I didn't mind the lack of opening credits, but when you signpost a Dr. Light episode by taking the credits out of the show, that was also a bit of an odd thing for me.
Damn, I don't even think I noticed that. They didn't run the credits?
Yeah, you just jump straight into 73 yards, and Millie Gibson and Shooty Gatwa's names are in small print on the bottom of the screen, not in the opening Starfield credits as they ordinarily would be.
Weird. So go back to fact. Which one's your favorite introduction? Because I have a strong opinion about this. Like, what's your favorite theme, Starfield?
My favorite visual is the season 11 John Pertwee intro, the very first flip scan intro, but my favorite of all time has to be my first one, which is the Peter Davison, which also was used for Tom Baker's last and Colin Baker's.
Yeah, that's my favorite. The theme song has never hit harder than it did there. Like, there's just something tame about it in the last several renditions. Like, it should bang harder. Like, it should get your heart rate up.
The newest Murray Gold version of the theme is gorgeous, and it has a lot of the little nooks and crannies that I really enjoy. I want to dive into that further in a later episode, but Zoom has us out of time. Lelon, thank you so much for talking to me. This has been a great conversation. 10% of it was about the arc.
We knew that was going to happen. I think we said all we need to say about the arc.
All right. Have a great night.
Thank you.
And now my review of 73 Yards, the 8th Doctor Who episode to stream on Disney+, and the 7th of those 8 to be written by RTD. The one RTD didn't write was written by a former Doctor Who showrunner, Stephen Moffat. I think Doctor Who benefits from a wide range of voices, but right now the show starts to feel like we're stuck in the Yellowstone universe, where Taylor Sheridan writes everything himself. That being said, this was a very different tone and vibe to anything else we've had so far on Disney+. I know I've previously stated that I was hoping RTD would come back to Doctor Who after nearly 15 years away, older, wiser, and tougher than his 2005 to 2009 run. 73 yards almost achieves that. I watched with Callie, who picked up on the plot twist a lot faster than I did. I'm informed by listeners Sean Lyon and Shannon Patrick Sullivan that this was the very first episode that Millie and Shooty recorded, even before Church on Ruby Road, and Shooty still had obligations to his other series, which is why he's only on screen for the equivalent of 1 day's filming. Callie marveled that Millie Gibson shot this at age 17, or perhaps 18 depending on the timing. Millie gives a great performance against a variety of guest actors, the different scene partner almost every 5 minutes, and across multiple time jumps. The episode in general defies expectations by starting as folk horror set in a pub, and then of course turning into many other things, most notably the Christopher Walken, Martin Sheen feature film adaptation of Stephen King's The Dead Zone. I like the false start sequence of Kate Stewart, not a character I enjoy, showing up, and then suddenly running away in abject terror. I like the Martin Sheen aspects of Roger Ap Williams' character. Roger, by the way, also made Callie laugh out loud, causing her to prompt the following observation.
That Roger, like, Prime Minister guy, he looks like a high Wish.com version of Harry Styles.
I think that's a very funny, spontaneous observation, which is why I asked her to repeat it into the recorder, although I confess the only word that I understood was the word he. But I do have a lot of questions about 73 yards. Who built the fairy trap in the first place? Now that the 73 yards woman no longer needs to exist, does that mean that in 2046 Roger Ap Gwilliam will no longer happen? Maybe all of this will be explained by the season finale, or maybe at my age my brain is no longer elastic enough to figure all this out for myself. I've seen some good explanations in my Facebook thread, based on a shorter version of this review, but maybe we'll know more in a month. I do know this was easily my favorite of the 5 Shooty and Millie episodes so far, and second place is far in the distance. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, we will wrap up our look at the Ark with a conversation with Jim Sangster and my long-awaited audio essay about the 1987 Paul Erickson novelization. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer of Doctor Who Literature is David Barsky, and the series is produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Lelon from Indoctrination. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.